One of the biggest challenges in cybersecurity, anyone who wears the hat of CISO or CIO, security analyst, they're probably wearing 5 or 6 other hats. They probably are doing many of the tasks that have arisen recently as threats have risen, but the business model hasn't changed, off the side of their desk. And one of the things we consider turning to, rather than staffing larger, is automation of defense and cybersecurity. I'm Mark Dillon, the VP of IT for Waterloo Hydro, and we're going to have a chat today about what it looks like when you attempt to, what the landscape is currently providing. So good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're viewing from. And I have Rick and Norm with me, and why don't we just go around a little bit and give some brief background about our involvement, what your role is, and how you hope to be able to utilize automation in cyber defense or visibility. Why don't we start with Rob?
Hey, absolutely. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. I like that phrase for sure, Mark. Thanks for the opportunity to speak here at CyberX. I'm Rob Davidson, the Director of Security Services and the Chief Information Security Officer at PBC. And absolutely, you hit the nail on the head. That automation conversation in security is important.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is Norm Chan. I am a pre-sales solutions engineer, and I work for SentinelOne. SentinelOne is a leader in the endpoint protection platform, EDR, and XDR space. I'm a 20-year practitioner in cybersecurity, and without a doubt, automation in the realm of cybersecurity for SentinelOne and for a lot of our customers, it's a very top of mind discussion item whenever I engage with our customer base.
Great. So Rob, it sounds like you and I might have some similar problems here. When is it you find yourself thinking about doing automation inside of your shop? And are there any places where you absolutely would never automate?
Mark, I hear we're supposed to call them opportunities instead of problems for sure. So I think there are a few opportunities, but you're probably right. The fact is, when we look at some of the things that just get done day after day, most folks think about automation in terms of how we do something more quickly, better, take care of a repetitive task to free people up to do something that's more meaningful, either the business or to security. But at the same time, when we look at the things we're doing in the long run with automation, the interesting parts are maybe how we connect with data sources and start to use those services to really offer something to the business that I think is compelling and return value. But that's also where it becomes concerning, because at that point, we have to take people's knowledge and put it into the automation flow correctly to get the biggest bang for the buck. But that's not always as easy as it sounds.
And when you talk about putting the people's knowledge into the system to automate it, how do you keep it up to date, that knowledge? Because that person, if it stayed inside of them, it would grow as the assessment of the landscape would change. How do you make sure that doesn't just get left to stale automation?
Great question. The reality is, I don't think you can just assume that automation is going to stay the same. In fact, regularly you have to work at having your security teams and your development teams, because this is one of those perfect times for probably the DevSecOps model in our case, to try and have a lot of teams work together cohesively to figure out how can you put together patterns and practices so we are constantly reevaluating the automation. Obviously, I look through the lens of security, but for a lot of folks, automation presents some interesting ways to do things in either new techniques or new ways that they hadn't before. And in doing that, that's also when you say, well, if we're going to do something new, we probably have to put in some sort of monitoring and a way to check in on a regular interval going forward.
And Norm, when someone like Rob or myself starts to think about this, starts to go down this path, you might be one of the people they talk to. When people come and want to work with you on automation of security, where are they usually at? And what made them think about it? And do they also have reservations about places where they say, no, we need to do that manually, that'll never be automated?
Right. Yeah, for sure, Mark. So typically, I engage with customers and of all shapes and sizes, and they're all at very different points in their journey in automating parts of cybersecurity. Invariably, what I find, some of the common denominators of what drive them to look at automating processes or automating procedures comes with the staff shortages that we see today. I don't know if you both, Rob, Mark, if you see that in your organizations today, but it's very difficult to attract and retain very skilled cybersecurity practitioners. And I think a lot of the customers that I deal with are looking at ways to to augment what they have today without increasing headcount, take those repetitive tasks that Rob was alluding to before, and whatever can be automated, do it in an intelligent way. There's some low-hanging fruit that just makes sense to be automated. Rob touched on DevSecOps, the whole CI/CD pipeline. When you are rapidly accelerating applications into production, when you're iterating and you're not using a waterfall model anymore, how do you build security into that pipeline? And I think automating it without having to sort of stop at the end when an application is sort of done in that waterfall model, it makes a lot of sense to add automation. But then, as Rob points out, having some checks and balances so that it doesn't become stale automation is really, really important. Otherwise, sort of garbage in, garbage out. But in terms of some specific low-hanging fruit, I think areas such as vulnerability scanning, repetitive tasks can be completely automated in our realm. And then when you start to get into sort of more sophisticated response kinds of actions is when you start to get into capabilities to actually do automated repair and rollback with less human need for interaction there.
Yeah, you touched on a couple things there. I want to give the audience a little bit of insight into what it's like to be responsible for this day to day. So if you took a typical company, 500 or 600 people, you probably have multiple buildings, although that may be changing. You have dozens of physical systems, hundreds of abstract systems. I mean, containers, virtual machines, pieces of software. You've got non-traditional IT devices like door controls, HVAC controls, video camera systems, even just printers. All of these things have a hardware component, a firmware component, and a software component. And every single day, we have a common vulnerability exposure for many of those devices. So this is the automated scanning that Norm talked about. So now you have a screen that tells you, here are the 8 screaming things that are so broken, someone could just get into your system right now. Now, in an organization like that, 500 or 600 people, you probably have 20 or 30 IT projects going on, and you probably have 15 to 20 staff, maybe. And they're doing help desk, they're doing network, they're doing storage. This security thing, no one asked for this additional demand and adversary. And so I guess one of the things, and you touched on it a bit, Rob, is the idea of when you consider automation. What are some common signs you've seen in both security and elsewhere where you think we really shouldn't be doing that manually? Can you think of a moment where you saw something and said, we can't afford to do this manually anymore?
Yeah, Mark, it's early in the morning here on the West Coast, and you're reminding me just how tough our job is. So it sounds like we share a lot of common difficulties when it comes to keeping on top of everything. And that's maybe what answers the question. It's about keeping on top of things. And for me, not forgetting to do some of those routine security basics as well as we can. So a good example is exactly what you're suggesting. Things like patching. Everybody knows we should patch in the most timely and expeditious way possible, which means, a vulnerability is noticed in a system. We want to make sure that we apply a patch to it. It sounds obvious, but in practicality, it's a very difficult thing because we have to do a lot of regression testing. We have to look across multiple systems. We have to think about on-premise versus on-cloud. So if you take something like just the test patterns that we put together to test a patch through regression against virtual machines and then run analysis, regress that, put it into the CI/CD pipeline so it is properly updated and say a golden image and then deployed, that is a great example of how I think automation really shows itself extremely well. Because a lot of that work nowadays it requires people really spoon feed step by step through certain things. And at the end of the day, some of the analysis has to be done by humans. You just need folks to say whether or not certain things are working. But those other tasks, I think it's a perfect example of taking automation and actually feeding things through in a system so that things happen quickly and we can verify and do analysis. The other area is just cloud. I don't think anyone nowadays can run cloud services by hand the way they used to. When you're on-prem and the team's in the data center and they know their servers, these are the machines and the environments that they've cared for sometimes many, many years. I'm sure Mark, Norm, you know all these environments where people actually think a lot about the servers they created as theirs and they kind of control them. Where in a virtual environment that's up in the cloud, you're much more okay with the idea of bringing something up for a quick test to run some sort of system or tool and then actually deleting the environment so it's gone entirely. Sometimes in, a matter of minutes. So automation is almost necessary to make that happen.
Norm, when do you see someone get, let's call it, overwhelmed, and what kind of successful automation have you been part of or deployed where you've said, you know what, that really did reduce that labor requirement. Now someone doesn't have to do this thing, or do you have another story similar to that?
Yeah, for sure. So, one of the areas that SentinelOne focuses on, of course, is endpoint protection and so-called EDR, or endpoint detection and response. And for, I'm sure many people in the audience know what that is already. But if you sat on the front lines and you've been staring at a console, and especially one that's delivering EDR or type data, it's really easy to get overwhelmed because you are looking at event data from across your entire fleet of managed endpoints, and we can be dealing with tens of thousands of points of telemetry just flying by your screen in in a matter of minutes, and that can be overwhelming. And that's a fantastic place for automation, where I've seen the implementation of the use of AI within an EDR console to separate the wheat from the chaff, right? To identify, make sense of that telemetry and identify both the suspicious and malicious attempts that could be, being perpetrated within the environment. And that just not only does it make for a better user experience, but you get a happier cybersecurity analyst at the end of the day who's just not, they're happier to do their job, right? They have higher efficacy, and they can go on to do other things instead of just worrying that they maybe missed that needle in a haystack. So the short answer is, applying some automation and some AI to not only repetitive tasks, but tasks that involve volumes of raw data that would be typically difficult for any normal human analyst to comprehend. And I see that often, right?
That's excellent, Norm. There's two things you touched on there that I want to let slip away. One of them is that, excuse me, one of the places that you would do automation would be in the tasks you aren't doing at all. You're not even trying to do them, like proper log analysis, proper packet inspection. You will never do that manually. And the other place that I thought of first as someone trying to run a team is when I know we're slipping. When I know we've got, 10 CVSS 9 and aboves that we're not going to patch today. We're not going to get to it. And right. You also spoke to the demoralizing effect that has on your analysts, because this is a tedious job. They have, like as everyone says, they need to be right 100% of the time, and they know what to do, but they don't have time to do it. I think that's excellent. That actually brings me to a discussion we've been having in our community that I think would be worth touching on, and that's how does the introduction and maturity of these automation tools actually change the kind of training you need to send your staff on? Change their world in a way that there's different pathways. Rob, let's start with you.
Yeah, there's so many opportunities for security personnel now. It's everybody constantly talks about the demand for these people in the field, but a lot of either new entrants to security or folks who've even been on an established team I think that they have a tendency not to necessarily follow the area that's most passionate to them. And whatever that area of passion is, maybe it's even something that, isn't the focus of some of the folks on this call, but you take an area like privacy. Even privacy has elements that there's automation possible for. And so there's this opportunity to take a business requirement, something like a privacy, or maybe you're part of a risk team, or maybe you want to be a true threat hunter. Any of those things you could actually still apply automation to. And likely, if you're going to carry that job forward and be as successful as you can, you want to be able to understand the tools that are available to you. And there's so many good ones that help people do their job and do two things, which are do the things for the security team so that, as you point out, Mark, you don't fall behind. But secondly, take some of the things that you're trying to accomplish and be able to provide insight back to the business. In other words, can we give folks that dashboard that they're constantly working for? The dashboard that sometimes goes to the executive and the board would be super hard to create if you didn't have automation tools in place and the people who are skilled to show those dashboards off, because eventually somebody's going to ask you what that graph means. And once you start peeling back the onion a little bit and looking at the layers of it, you really need folks that are insightful to provide you the real truth of what the data and the story tells.
So Rob, for your staff, when you bring in a new tool that has automated one of the tasks they used to do manually, how do you reconcile that work is now coming back and has some information for you, but the task is done, and B, get them to embrace and be competent in the tool?
Yeah, I think that the secret to success there is to first really understand what your team's doing today. If you've got a good understanding of what the analysts are working on and what their plans are and where their skill sets sit and their level of maturity with a process today. So if they, for instance, really understand, for instance, data loss prevention and keeping control of classified information, then as I talked about early on, it's about taking those folks, making them the subject matter experts and giving them the first opportunity to feed into the tool that you're bringing on board. Let them be the ones who really set up the knowledge that most of these tools need to be successful, and then give them the opportunity to decide, do they also want it to be part of their purview to operate that tool and to give that reporting feedback that I mentioned before. That gives most folks, I think, a compelling sense of ownership when it comes to adding in these new services and tools.
Norm, you'd be at the leading edge of this because you may be helping to contribute and create the material and applications that people are going to have to discover and understand. What have you seen in the training pathways that are opening up for people that are different than traditional security analyst roles or CISO roles?
Well, it's interesting because I have this one small example where I was working with a customer who traditionally was a very heads down, who was looking for those needles in the haystack, and who was one of those potentially getting burned out, disgruntled cyber analysts. And because the automation that they were able to employ to his job satisfaction was higher, but because he was more or less freed from having to do this repetitive volume kind of a task, he was really now expected to provide a higher level of, or perform a higher level function within the organization. And he more or less lacked that interpersonal higher level communication skills, those skills that to communicate what he was doing and the results of his work effectively to the business. So he was a fantastic analyst, right? Really a ones and zeros kind of person. But because a lot of that hardcore work was now made easier for him, and he had to perform this higher level task of communicating to directors and so on what the results of what he was doing. So he went on interpersonal training. He went on communication. He was sent on interpersonal training and just to improve his communication skills. So in terms of, I don't know if you want to call it opportunities, but those are certainly areas where automation is going to, not only does it make the analyst a better analyst, but now they're going to have to upscale their communication skills to something a little more than just looking at a matrix style ones and zeros floating down the screen all day long.
Would it be fair to say that part of their job that they were supposed to be doing was carved out because of volume of another task, and that perhaps that was in a sense done to them as well? The loss of that interpersonal skill may have been a result of not having enough time to even talk to people.
Yeah, it's quite possible. You know, where you have there's that trope or that stereotype of the say take the traditional analyst who sits in a dark room and who drinks Jolt Cola and Tito's all day. I think there's a bit of that stereotype, and when you're not interacting with people as much, but in this particular case, he's becoming an excellent analyst where you talk to his director, and the opportunities to upscale his communication capabilities of he's going to be even higher value to the organization and to himself and his career in the future.
That sounds like a great story, and we see that it freed up some time, and the person was able to take on some tasks and some personal growth. So now we've automated something that used to be manually done and probably could never be finished on a day-to-day basis. Rob, one of the things you spoke about was that thing we're chasing all the time, which is that business intelligence dashboard for visibility, which brings me to, now that we've automated the thing, how do we actually measure and demonstrate that it's working, not just that we did it? How do we show the success of automation?
Yeah, absolutely. Which, when you think about it, that ultimately is what the business thinks about. They probably don't think about, the near misses that the analyst saved us from so many times day in and day out. So at the end of the day, what you want to do is be able to provide insight back to the business on the things they probably care most about. So in a lot of cases, they can give you guidance about the things they think are important to them. And then you can also give other metrics and other indicators that are also valuable to them. I would say, and it's somewhat to add on to Norm's point, but these dashboards are not unique per organization. I think a lot of organizations are looking for the same information at the end of the day. I know, especially by vertical, if you look at us in the health and insurance space, a lot of health and insurance carriers are going to want that same sort of data. So the other thing that I think is a great opportunity for the audience listening today, when you think about what automation does, is there's a chance in security tools to really share best practices and knowledge. And one of the things that's great about the cybersecurity community is there is sharing. People get together, they have special interest groups, they have, different groups like CyberX where you're sharing this body of knowledge. I think automation may be the next frontier for a lot of those things. If you get good at doing automation on a certain process and create those dashboards, I don't see any reason why there isn't an opportunity to share those as well. So I guess to answer the question, there's dashboards that we think we're creating, and I think that there's dashboards that others are going to create that we'll want to consume, and maybe we're going to want to make our dashboards at some level available to others so that they can say, hey, those folks seem to have the right thing, they've done some good work, and that sharing, I think, will make us all better in the long run.
So yeah, I think we all have that same dream to demonstrate as real time as we can value. Norm, do you have any examples where you've actually seen that happen, or do you have a perspective on the right way to measure automated cybersecurity?
Yeah, it's a toughie, gentlemen. From in my seat, always trying to demonstrate the value of the technology. Sometimes it's often, people often think of security as a bit of an insurance policy that they loathe having to spend. I think that those thoughts for most progressive companies are mostly waning, but to demonstrate the value ultimately requires to understand what the customer's definition of value is. From some lower level perspectives, it is catch rates. Tell me about how many things were mitigated on a weekly or monthly basis, and then typically at higher levels, catch rates are far less important. It's conversations around hours of time that were saved in handling of incidents, or how did you make it easier to recover a machine that was perhaps owned by ransomware, things like that, and then putting it onto a getting a consistent flow to generate those metrics. And as Rob was saying, get them onto some kind of dashboard. It's certainly varies across all the orgs that I deal with.
You made me think of something there when you talked about the safety net aspect of security approach. So, you think of people buying actual cyber insurance, which, you can pay down ransomware, but you cannot pay down a server room fire. And the other thing I was thinking about was, I was at a conference once. I think someone had given a quote, and they said that they had heard someone speaking saying that security is the side dish that we're ordering with everything now. And they said, no, it's not a side dish, it's the plate. So maybe with some new applications we can get to that, but there's a lot of legacy stuff that needs going back and rethinking it, even just contracted vendors. So it's going to take us quite a while. And as that life cycling happens, there's going to be, attrition in our organizations. And I'm wondering if anyone is seeing an effect on the workforce, people who are prepared, people who are trained up and ready to start working, if they're arriving differently now that automation tools may be part of their landscape as part of their academic career. Rob, are you seeing any of that?
I think so. I think that, I was first going to comment that depending on which conference you're at, security is either the main plate, as you mentioned, or the side plate. So if it's a security conference, then I'm going to say definitely the main plate for me, for sure. If it's a financials conference, then maybe it's slightly different. But I think for most of us, we're thankfully past the notion of justifying why it's so important to the business. And so when people come on board, I think that's part of it too, making sure that the people who are, in fact, those analysts also feel just, properly respected and treasured as a meaningful part of the business. And so the thing that I have noticed is for a lot of analysts and a lot of security personnel, there is an expectation around the maturity of the tools you're going to give them. With as many as many opportunities exist that are out there now, a lot of folks kind of have a choice of a few jobs and a few areas to go to. And if you say, well, we're going to do everything in an old-fashioned way, we're not going to use new tools, we're not going to use new clouds or services, I tend to think that's going to be less compelling. I think the other thing is that a portion of any job is really giving people some sort of roadmap for their training and skill set to build themselves. And I've had people during interviews say, well, this is where I'm going to start. And how are you going to help me in 2-3 years get to here? Automation and other tools, I think, is a big part of that, because that's all part of helping them improve their skill set. And as Norm points out, maybe it's not always technical. It can be soft skills as well. But that combination is compelling to folks to come on board.
Rob, if I may jump in on that one, I'm going to echo that. I saw an example just last week where we were engaging with a prospect, and we were talking about the drivers and what was important for them in terms of why they were upscaling their security posture. And one of the soft reasons, well, it was actually rather became hard for them, but they coached it as a soft reason, was that they were having difficulty retaining staff using the tooling that they had today. So they would have staff come in, and they would begin to do what the cyber team does, and they would kind of throw up their hands and say, really, like I can't track this down, I can't go after this without suitable tooling, and that impacted them materially. That was one of their motivations for moving to technology that had automation.
Yeah, I suppose if you came from a place where it was there, and then you change roles and you say, well, what am I supposed to do with these tools? And I've actually landed in places where I've been to an organization and said, wow, we've got 3 years to get to where I was when I left. And I guess I never thought about what that would do to someone who comes on that's very tactical, that's very frontline, saying, what do you mean this is our monitoring system? What do you mean you don't use this? What do you mean there's a policy that forbids the best practice? What were you going to say?
No, I was just I was agreeing with you, because I saw that firsthand, just like as I say, just a week ago.
So I guess the place I think near the end in my head is, why aren't we there yet? How come it's so difficult to bring in some of these obvious things. I've got some things that maybe I'll save, but Rob, what is the thing that's stopping you from putting automation in where you want to, where you know you need to?
Yeah. Well, I think for many of us, we need the driving force. Like I said, there's certain things that we don't feel like we can get to without automation. So as we pivot towards cloud, I don't think it's an option anymore. So we use that as a reason to perhaps build our competency, build our skill set, build the tools that we need to do automation. That's where it might be successful, but it takes a while because that whole move to cloud, of course, is a journey unto itself. The other thing that is a barrier sometimes is things work the way they are, and people are comfortable with the way certain things are done. And there are analysts that enjoy some of the process of even their routine today. So you have to do two things. You have to make sure if you're going to change something that the people that are so important to running your security environment are 100% on board and they want to make those changes. And then the second thing is it's not a small investment. These tools are material and cost, they're material and training, there is all the things that we talked about of benefits are usually once they're in place and everything's running the way you want, assuming that you get to things working the way you want them to. And that can be hard. So for a while, you have to come up, at least for our organization, with something of a case study, put together some sort of business proposition, again, first to make sure that the investment is behind you to put in the automation and the tools that you're looking for ultimately. And so I don't think that people will invest heavily in automation until those other things, those requirements are met. And that makes it seem like it's a little while to get there for a lot of things, and automation is one.
Norm, when someone comes to you and they want to bring in automation, do they have a realistic timeline in their head? Are they typically shorter or longer than they thought? And what are the kinds of things that you see get in the way?
Yeah, I'm going to echo a few things that Rob pointed out. Is sometimes things just there's an expectation that things work the way that they've always worked, and there's a little bit of resistance. Sometimes I find there's a little bit of mistrust in that automation. So, small example: if a organization, if the business has a use case to improve, say, incident response times, or the goal is to improve their incident response times, and they're looking at a technology to improve that. I found there's some inherent distrust of the technology in the automation. So I find that it takes time to educate, it takes time to demonstrate, and eventually the trust improves, and that's where I see success is to prove it out. There's people are from the show me province or the show me state. You got to prove to me that this automation isn't going to make me less secure. That really is going to do what it says that it's going to do.
So from a personal perspective, the biggest hurdle I've had against or that's prohibited automation, even though everyone wanted to do it, are systems built on a style that's really anti-pattern towards being able to automate it. So one of the things that we talk about is not just having security automation in its own silo, but really we're talking about automation in general. So one of the things we start to talk about is what's called infrastructure as code. The idea of having a instruction set to build a system so that when you need to patch it, you can rebuild it, or you need to make a systems change, it's consistent and someone didn't log in and make an SSH rule change for one Linux server, or some kind of RDP exception for one Windows server. And what typically gets in the way is systems that are so manually cobbled together, let's call it, that automating insight against them becomes cumbersome, that it may break them, or that their visibility outputs are so unique that they become an exception. Well, we're not going to include that in our visibility layer because it is so strange. Rob, have you done anything to deal with systems like that? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of them. That's maybe part of the issue. If you look at the way a lot of servers were deployed in the old days, to my comment before, there was a lot of care and feeding that went into these environments. People created custom environments. They built it over the years. And you need a lot of automation, and a lot of other base tool sets. I mean, virtualization is one of those examples where it was a physical machine and then moved to a virtual machine. Virtual machines, the benefit is the flexibility and capability it gives. So to automate virtualization becomes that much easier. But if you look at the base environment, it gets to be probably diminishing returns if something's so custom that it rarely gets deployed, and it requires a lot of hands-on work. But I think the majority of workloads going forward, and maybe it's that line of delineation again. There might be things that were done previously or environments that were created previously where there isn't necessarily as much benefit to go back and retool and re-automate. But going forward, I think that's really what presents the opportunity when we do things in a new way for cloud services or a hybrid environment. That really, I think, just screams out the desire for automation around both deployment, operations, and certainly security.
So we're talking about drawing a line in the sand and saying, all right, all systems forward will behave properly. We acknowledge we have this stuff over here that we're not thrilled about, and maybe we'll create a plan to get it in line over 5 years or something like that. Have you worked with a client that wanted to bring in security automation against an atypical system, something so strange that exceptions or even custom work was required?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, the goal always, of course, is that, you want the vast majority of the systems to have the benefits of that automation. Invariably, there's going to be some systems where, as I was saying before, there is a reluctance to not employ that level of automation, sometimes because of the custom nature of that system or its legacy, and because it's unsupported even by the manufacturer, that it's lacking some of the fundamental underpinnings to support modern automation. So then your customer is often left with employing other mechanisms. Call it, for example, for micro-segmentation. You're not going to be able to automate all the security flows on a given system because it's legacy. So how are you going to protect it? Well, you're going to treat the system or the group of systems as somewhat hostile, and you're going to micro-segment them into an area of the network, different area of the network, things like that. Those are they're far and few between, I find, with most customers. Mind you, however, I did run into a customer earlier this month that still had some Windows NT running, and there's just nothing you can do with that. Okay, there's nothing that you can do with that with their NT servers.
Wow. So I haven't touched Windows NT in I think since I was a kid. Honestly, it's a long time ago. That maybe was one of the first server OSs I ever touched. But by the time I was in the workforce, it was time for Windows 2000. That's incredible. But I think that's probably something like an ICS system or some very old software no longer supported by the manufacturer.
That's exactly what it is, Mark. Yeah, it was a manufacturing system, and in fact, the customer is in a scenario where upgrading that software requires an update to their physical automation machines that do assembly, and they just have to keep this NT box running. It's not going to work and support any of the advanced flows for security automation, and they just have to segment it off.
And we could have a whole separate rabbit hole discussion about that. But why ICS and PLC should speak a non-proprietary language that has an open protocol that would prevent all of those problems from existing. But I think we have a question. It's a little too small for me to read, though. If I look over here. There we go. So I guess the question coming to us from the audience is, have we ever seen a real calculated ROI towards virtualization of legacy systems that require extensive customization, such as building APIs or microservices around something like a mainframe? So I think we've all fantasized about it. Rob or Norm, have you ever seen anything like that?
Maybe Norm has help build some case studies around things like that. I can tell you from my experience, you probably are not going to get the big bang in terms of ROI and virtualization from the automation parts. Most of the case studies talk about the reduction of footprint of physical environments, less heating, less cooling, maybe less personnel, certain staff. And even that, there's always a good question as to how real is that ROI. But some of the virtualization vendors, I think, have done a good job trying to capture the cost savings to virtualize from a physical environment. For instance, if it was a mainframe, and some environments that I know still have, and amazingly are slowly over the last few years moved from a mainframe, that's an environment that does take tremendous cost, tremendous specialization just to run the physical system and everything that houses it and all the support personnel, if you can even find them, amazingly. So to move to virtualization, I think that the savings where it's possible is the flexibility virtualization gets you and the cost saving. Automation is really icing on the cake. I think automation, the difficulty is if you say you're going to take somebody's job and partially have them work somewhere else, that's the difficulty in figuring out, well, what's the ROI there? So it's tough sometimes to quantify. I think there is an opportunity to do some level of quantification that says, whether it's a backup operation or another service, we think we were spending this percentage of IT budget just on the management of a process. And therefore, the ROI when we automate is that we get X percentage of IT budget back. But if somebody really leaned in on that number and pushed hard on it, it's tough to say. I think it's ever going to be a huge big number compared to some of the other savings that virtualization offers.
So Norm, have you worked with any customers where you've had to help them move forward from a legacy system? So Windows NT, you said, well, you know what, there's not a lot we can do there. But maybe you had a customer like that, and as part of bringing in automation, you helped them get their system ready.
Yeah, so certainly when I get engaged, we're looking at, of course, security automation. So we try to quantify, as Rob's pointing out, time and dollars spent on particular processes and that they're doing with said legacy systems, and how those improve when you move over to to a something that's post NT that you can apply some automation to. So when I do get involved, it becomes an exercise in just quantifying, right? Let's talk about the processes that you're doing today that are manual, and what those processes, the reduction that you will, the cost savings in both people power, and sometimes there's that translates to hard dollars. And then by not moving said system, what is the expense that you're going to incur. So I haven't been involved in specific hard case studies, but that's the exercise that I walk customers through when I, in that kind of scenario.
So I've been involved, to finish off on the question, I've been involved in a few projects to modernize the way the business, not the business, because the reason you have a system like an OS 400 system or a mainframe system is because you've got business software on there that still works, and the business has no reason to change, and the cost of change is not justified by the benefit of moving to a new system. Where there is a benefit is where the IT operations can now properly surveil the system. So there's a calculable, I wouldn't call it ROI, I would call it risk avoidance. And so there's really interesting literature that I've seen applied not too often around quantitative risk management. There's a book by Donald Hubbard, I believe it's called, How to Measure Anything. And it tells you to look at risk ranges when presenting to it. And then there's a bunch of fancy math that you'd have to employ. I think it's a concept that I'm academically curious about, is the idea of pinning down a dollar amount for the risk aversion by doing something like upgrading a mainframe system to something that you can, or spending the specialized labor that Rob talked about, because it's not cheap to find people that can work on these systems. Getting them to a place that's a system like that where you can surveil it the same as you can a Linux server or a Windows server is a large task that requires very special skills. But the de facto is that the business will pretend the system doesn't exist from a risk perspective. And the whole point of this discussion for me is that I know at some point we are going to have to automate because our adversaries are automating. And once we see the real impact of their competency, we can't hire enough people to combat that. There's no way to do it. So it's going to be sort of a robot war that's already starting on the internet right now. Rob and Norm, I want to thank you very much for having this great discussion. We could go on for another 30 minutes easily, but unfortunately, we're out of time, and I want to thank CyberX for hosting this.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Norm. Good to see you.
Thank you very much, Rob and Mark. It was fun.